Adrian, we've included your poem Valediction in The Invisible Thread.
Yeah.
And it's a very poised and evocative poem. Can you tell us about how it came about, where it came from?
Sure. It came from a trip to South Australia, in fact, where we stayed on a small property in McLaren Vale, which stands above a valley with vines. And it's a very beautiful place. Eagles fly, but it's a working vineyard with a property on it, so that you see the workers working. And it's a poem about a holiday there and leaving it, and the sense of how those times, very precious times, are soon over. And it's a poem really about appreciating that, but also I wanted to evoke something of that working landscape that I love very much in McLaren Vale. The vineyard, it's very beautiful it kind of geographically, but I love it because it's a working landscape as well.
Yeah, well, you certainly get a real sense of that landscape and the beauty of it, and a sense of kind of longing, and yeah, it's a beautiful piece. Tell us about the process of writing it.
Oh, wow. I suppose the process of, I think that literally as we drove away from it, I kind of had a sense, this often happens to me when I'm writing poems or about to write a poem, that I kind of see it before I write it. I kind of recognize, I think, ooh, there's a poem. And it happened to me as we were driving away, and I think the first line came to me more or less straight away. But then, of course, there's the process, you know, get home, think, oh, I had that line. What am I going to do with it?
Do you remember that line, or do you write it down?
No,
you just
I remembered
keep it in your head?
Yeah. I do quite a lot of writing in my head. And I can carry poems for a long time in my head before they actually arrive on the page. But I mean, this was written some years ago, so my memory of writing it isn't particularly sharp. But my sense of it is that I knew the feeling of it and what I wanted to say. So then it's a question of making sure you kind of try and deliver that on the page.
When you say that you often carry a poem in your head for quite a while, what's happening in that time?
I hope it's growing. I remember writing a poem about onions and the way they grow in the dark, and then, you know, and I feel that's poems are like that for me, that often I can have an idea and maybe even have a go at it and it won't work, and I think, oh, too soon, and you just let it kind of grow until you really feel you must write it down. And that's when I start, when I feel that it has to arrive onto the page.
So once it starts arriving onto the page, what's the process then? How long does that take, and do you do a lot of editing?
Oh yeah, yes. But I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that it varies from poem to poem. Some kind of arrive a lot easier than others. And my memory of a Valediction is that it was one of the relatively easy. That doesn't mean it didn't go through 10 drafts, but my sense of it is that I had a very sharp idea of what I wanted to do and what I wanted to say. I think with other poems, where maybe you're moving from an image that's caught you and you're trying to work out why that meant what it meant to you, and you're trying to unravel something in the process of writing, it takes a lot longer. But editing all the time, of course, you know, I mean, it seems to me that that's what writing is, in a sense. It's teaching yourself to edit yourself, which is, as you'd be aware, a difficult process, a difficult thing to do.
How do you know when to stop? Because that's part of it too, isn't it?
And absolutely. And again, you know, I think that there's no easy answer to that. I think sometimes the poem says to you stop, and you think, yeah, I think that's, I've done my very best with that. Sometimes I get to the point where I feel I'm making it worse, so which is another indication. I feel with poems that I have a certain kind of instinct about it. I find prose even more difficult to edit, frankly. But it is what writing's about, I think, is understanding that. I'm very fond of a phrase that Alex Miller used in an essay, where he talked about working and working until his work shone with a light that was not its own, his own. So that sense of it becoming something, I don't know, other. And I really like that. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Mm.
You touched on prose writing just then, and you work in both forms. How do you find moving between them, and do they feed into each other, or are they quite separate in the way you work?
I think they're quite separate, which is a nuisance. I think being involved in a big prose project tends to absorb so much energy that you've not got much left. So what I tend to do when I'm working, as I have been the last few years, on big kind of prose projects, I make little notes to myself and I carry a lot in my head. And then when I'm not working on the prose, I get into the poems and have a wonderful time, maybe even just writing one or two or three. But it's a kind of joyous thing in between kind of working on these big prose projects. Which are also, I'm doing the big prose projects because they're compelling me. It's because I think that's what I, as it were, need to be doing. But yeah, the great thing to me about poems is that you can, in a sense, write them in the margins of your life, in a sense. The concentrated work of a poem, 2 hours, 3 hours, you can fit that in while you're doing a full-time job. And I felt that writing long prose projects is very, very difficult to do like that. There's something about the rhythm of writing narrative and writing a big prose piece where you feel, or I feel, I have to be in it every day or else I lose it.
So do you have certain rituals associated with writing or particular times of the day? Not rituals as such, I don't think. But yes, times of the day, morning, I'm very keen on energy levels up. Let's get at it. These days, when I was a young man, I used to write poems in the middle of the night. Of course, I suppose that's what young men do. These days, yes, I like to be at my desk by 10. Do a good morning till 1. Have my lunch, 2 to 4, reading and research or doing other things, whatever I've got on at the time. And then I have another writing session from 4 to 6 with a cup of tea. Sounds great.
It is.
Now, you were part of the advisory committee for The Invisible Thread, and together we all read through the work of over 150 writers, non-fiction, fiction, poetry. So after that massive undertaking, what was your kind of overall impression of writing from this region?
Well, inevitably, my overall impression was how rich it was. Before the process, you're kind of aware that there is a body of work, and you're aware of all these names, some of whom, of course, you've read and you're familiar with the work, others perhaps not so. But actually encountering the work, as it were, yes, what impresses itself forcibly is the depth and the richness of it, which, of course, has made the task difficult, as you would be very aware.
Yeah.
So do you think that experience broadened your perception or completely changed it?
I think it broadened it. I don't think it changed it. I became much more, I think, definitely aware of how rich the region was in historians, for instance. You know, Clark, Bean, Gamage, English, we can go on, Peter Stanley, Griffith. I mean, that was became clearer to me than it had before. Again, very rich in poetry as well, which I knew more about to begin with, obviously. And the variety of prose and the younger prose writers coming through, as well as the people like Marion Halligan and John Clanchy, whose work I knew very well, but I was very happy to reacquaint myself with how very good they are. So yes, it was a broadening and a depthing.
And we all made some wonderful discoveries along the way, writers who we hadn't had a chance to read, or little gems of work. What were some of your most notable discoveries?
Gems were surprised me in a way, because they were from people whose work I thought I knew, if you see what I mean. But I had a delightful time with Bob Brissenden, for instance, who I had the privilege of meeting a few times. And I'd read one or two of his poems, thought they were good, but reading them in a more concentrated way, I thought it was some just delightful work. Similarly with David Campbell. And Susan Hampton, who of course I know, and whose work I've read. But reading her latest book was one of the great pleasures of the work that I did. I just think that it's just a fabulous book of poems. So yes, those were my little gems. I mean, I could go on, but you know, they're the ones that immediately I remember thinking, wow, you know, this is great. Mm.
And in terms of Canberra more broadly, you've lived here since the 80s, but you were born in Manchester. How do you think Canberra as a place has, or both the places in fact, have affected you and your writing?
Wow. Well, yes, coming from the northwest of England, and from the kind of background that I come from, I think that affects my writing kind of almost totally in ways. I think it has determined my address to an audience or to an imaginary audience. I always try to write as if I'm writing to as broad an audience as I can, and I think that's about my background. My ideas about literature are not elitist. I cling to democratic notions about what art is and what it can do. So I think that's about my Manchester background. Canberra, wow. It's been a place for me that's enabled me to write. It's a place, obviously, that has a big percentage, an educated population, a population that's interested in the arts, interested in writing, interested in poetry. So there is a sense that there is a community out there who are interested. It's also an enormously easy and privileged place to live in. So there's all this quietness. I mean, I'm surrounded by quietness, which is fantastic. Yet I can get in the car and be in the National Library in 20 minutes. So the big institutions like the National Library and the War Memorial have been very important to my research work and the development of that. So, I mean, Canberra's been a fantastic place in that way, that both in terms of the sense of an audience that cares, the sense of a place that's interested in literature, and a great place for a writer to live, it seems to me. A valediction.
If you must leave, it is best to go at dawn, when the sun first cuts a strict blue line across horizons, ruling the sum of all that's past and what's to come, before you mark in the full blaze of another day what might have been, the poetry of a further stay. That eagle soaring in the valley, the men at work in shorts and broad hats among the vines. For in the grey no light it is possible to think that those afternoons when we lay together, wine-lipped in the old stone farmhouse, are only the ragged remnants of a dream which must be abandoned to the gravel road, the necessary steep climb to age and loss. Do not look back, and do not wonder when you'll return again.